In April of 1865, the guns that had fired for the Civil War fell silent after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. A few weeks later, a smaller Confederate force in North Carolina would surrender to Union General William T. Sherman. While the guns of the Civil War may have fallen silent here, the war over the memory of the war and how its reputation would be held did not end. And thus begins a new war, the war over the memory of the Civil War. As the defeated Confederates returned home, they sought to justify this bloody and brutal war that they had just fought for 4 years. Now, why did they fight this war? Why did they secede? Many would simply say it a vague term, it is states' rights. However, these states' rights are very clearly linked to slavery if you look at what they had been saying at the time, such as how Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, in a speech in 1861, says that the cornerstone of the Confederacy rests on slavery. However, Southern historians later on kind of sought to change the narrative over to it being a vague term, like I said earlier, of states' rights. Now, many modern historians would ask states' rights to do what? And, of course, the answer to that is own slaves, and that's not an opinion, that's just a statement of fact. But the purpose of this podcast is to help people understand this topic and the debate over it. One of the ways that this lost cause helped to spread itself was through 4 things: education, mainly in the South, through textbooks and the like, and museums, historical sites, and monuments. Now, in a recent article, the current curator of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, Christopher A. Graham, talked about this whole topic, and the museum that he was head curator of, the American Civil War Museum, originally started its life off as the Confederate Museum in, I believe, 1894. However, in the 1970s, with the shifting tides caused by things such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Confederate Museum was renamed to the Museum of the Confederacy, and as recent as in 2014, actually, the museum was again renamed to simply just the American Civil War Museum. All of these renamings were attempts to kind of move away from the lost cause, because that original Confederate Museum in the 1890s was opened essentially as a shrine honoring the Confederacy, not really as an academic museum as many of us would expect when we go to a museum. We expect a balanced narrative. Same thing with historical sites. And Graham, in his article, writes about, since he was part of helping in the 2014 transition, he writes about how a lot of these historical sites could kind of make that transition. And kind of, not to just talk about the, Confederate states' rights flowery story, but to also talk about the stories of Union soldiers, white and black, and to also talk about the stories of the formerly enslaved. And to make sure that people, even when they're touring like a battlefield, don't forget that that is what the war was over. Another tool, as I mentioned earlier, is monument construction. And now that one's been in the news a lot because of a lot of protests over these monuments, because many people in the modern day see them as problematic. And one of those groups that see them as problematic are historians. But why are these monuments problematic? So these monuments started popping up almost immediately after the Civil War ended. And they were mainly built by a couple of groups, mainly the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the United Confederate Veterans, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And all of these groups are very self-explanatory in who could join them, i.e. the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or I'll be calling them the UDC from here on out because that's shorter and I want to save some time. The UDC only allowed women who were the descendants of Confederate soldiers or politicians to join them. So the main purpose of all these groups was to memorialize the Confederacy, not to memorialize the war dead, as some people would suggest, but many historians would now point out, such as William Lees, that these monuments were more so intended to help spread the lost cause, and only incidentally honor war dead. I mean, if they were meant to honor war dead, Lees suggests why not put them in a cemetery? Why put them in a public square? Another interesting piece of research comes from Adam Chamberlain and Alexandra B. Yanis that points that these monuments were used, especially by the UDC, which is who they studied in specific, to kind of help mobilize new members to the UDC and get them to join their cause. In fact, William Lees, who I suggested earlier, in his paper suggests that the monuments should not be seen as just monuments, but they should instead be seen as monuments to the lost cause. So, if historians all agree that these monuments are so problematic, the question arises, what is to be done about them? Well, in a recent article by Washington Post journalist Mark Fisher, he interviewed several groups involved, and such as the UDC and members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, who they don't want to see anything at all happen to them. Nothing. And they say this because they believe that the monuments are monuments to their ancestors, that they're honoring their heritage. Whilst many civil rights activists, historians see them more so as symbols of hate from a bygone era that should come down and either go into museums, storage, or be moved to more appropriate locations, such as cemeteries. An interesting thing was also members of municipal government and areas interviewed wanted them removed because they caused so many protests and demonstrations, and they're just kind of a bit of a public nuisance to them because of that. William Lees, who I, again, mentioned earlier, had a very nuanced and very interesting take on this, where Lees proposed that monuments be evaluated on their artistic merits, such as how, I mean, for an example, a lot of them were bought through mail-in catalogs, so they were mass-produced in factories, so those ones really aren't very artistic, but some of them were artistic. While many historians and academics agree that these monuments are troublesome and have caused a lot of problems, it seems unlikely that a public consensus will soon be reached. However, this podcast hopes to help inform you whenever you're thinking about this topic or it comes up in the news again. Have a good day.